Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our Introduction to Web Development series, and we're going to focus on the roles and companies associated with web development. This video is not intended to be a comprehensive view of the roles, but rather just an overview so you can sort of appreciate where we fit into the development cycle. So to begin with, we want to take a look at backend roles. These are the ones that are considered classically the ones behind the scenes. They start with the infrastructure and the architecture required to support then web development and multiple facets of web development, such as database servers, DNS servers, and so on. And usually that is done by some sort of hardware architect or network architect. They're going to be interested in specifying the servers that are going to be required. That generally comes with the expected load, the expected uptime. Along those lines, then you'll also want to think in terms of the air conditioning requirements for a given server, the amount of power that will be required for backup, the amount of throughput with respect to the network that might be needed, and so on. And so those are going to be considered architecture decisions that in some cases are going to be made long before the first web service or web server is even being hosted. This is also part of the reason that you would oftentimes want to consider having some sort of data center handle this responsibility, because they are going to be very versed in the current state of the technology. The other thing that you want to consider with respect to the architecture is going to be the security aspect of things. And as I mentioned in an earlier video, your best bet with security is simply going to be physical security. In other words, making sure that no one can physically get access to your machine. Now, along those same lines, then we want to take a look at the next role, and that is going to be the system administrator role. This person generally steps in after the initial development, after the initial architecture decisions have been made, the hardware has been purchased, the systems are in place, perhaps in a rack in an air-conditioned room behind a locked door, et cetera, et cetera. And they are going to be responsible then for installing the operating systems, maintaining the software updates, making sure then that no hard drives have failed, and so on. And so their role is going to be really in the support after the initial implementation. Now, the key thing to note with respect to web development in that this has evolved a little bit over time, that your system administrator is not likely going to have any direct access to your website or your web development environment. They are merely going to be responsible for supporting, for instance, the file backups. They are not going to be the ones necessarily responsible for directly giving or denying permissions to a particular site and so on. Those roles, as things have evolved, have been discretized even further. A good example of this would be, would you necessarily want your system administrator to have access to patient information that might reside on a database server? And the answer is quite possibly not. And if you take a look at some of the models, for instance, that Microsoft is currently using with its Windows Server environment with respect to SQL Server, you'll see that they have further refined those roles, in particular the system administrator and the database administrator role, to the point where the system administrator does not have any direct access to the database itself. Likewise, you would not want your database administrator to necessarily be updating or patching the machines, because there may be multiple resources on a given server. So there is a move to further refine those system administration roles. The next role, like I said, that we want to take a look at is going to be the database administrator. They're really going to be responsible for things like the database schema, making sure that the correct roles or users have been implemented in the database. They might be interested in the database backups, not necessarily the whole system backups, but just those associated with the database. They're going to work closely with the data architect to understand the structure that's going to be needed, the data types that are going to be needed, and quite potentially even the database style itself that's going to be needed. Why would those things matter? Well, oftentimes the data type, as in other situations, affects then the total storage size and the efficiency of the system. Now, as mentioned earlier, security is going to be a very important part, both physical security and, if you would, virtual security. Physical security then is going to be handled usually when the architecture decisions are going to be made. That may be at the room level, the building level, or quite possibly just at the server rack level. But there are other aspects of security that may be handled both in-house and externally through some sort of consulting or contracting. And the best example of that might be something along the lines of white hat experts, intrusion detection, and so on. And a lot of this can also be handled through best practices. And this, once again, is sort of evolving into its own separate discipline or role. In addition, you may have some security concerns with respect to your firewall, with your VPN, and so on. And hence, this is a separate role that may directly or indirectly impact your website. Moving on from that, then the software engineer's role is going to be not necessarily looking at the physical architecture, but looking at the software architecture. In other words, they are going to be responsible for making decisions on what type of frameworks or libraries you may choose in a given implementation. They're going to be interested in looking at things like software support, sustainability, maintainability, and so on to make sure that you're building the best product for your client. And then ultimately, a lot of this work falls to the developer and programmer. And oftentimes that role is downplayed a little bit, or if anything, it's merged into the software engineering role. But those are two separate roles. The developer or the programmer is going to be the one that's going to be intimately aware with the details of a given section of code or a given process. Now, all of these focus on the back-end roles, but we can also do the same now for the front-end roles. And the front-end roles are going to be focused more on the user experience or UX experience, or the UI experience, user interface experience. And if anything, they're going to have a different set of concerns. And for instance, they're not necessarily going to be interested in the data support on the back end, but they might be interested in the time to load for a particular application. They may be interested in the user accessibility requirements. Perhaps if you think in terms of disability support, be able to have reader software, being able to read a particular page and so on. And so there's really two roles here. One is going to be the designer and then the developer. The designer is going to be looking much more at the aesthetics, maybe looking at the usability, the overall flow of your site, and so on, how, for instance, data is being input or how it's being conveyed to the user. Is it the best use of a graph and so on? And then you're going to have the test and quality assurance. Those oftentimes fall under the test engineer's role. The idea is that they will simply, on a functional level, try to break your system. In other words, they will be looking at, did this current release of the site change any of the behavior? And they will oftentimes be the one responsible for putting in internal support tickets, identifying what steps were required to make a particular piece of software break or a particular website break. And then an emerging role, definitely in the last 5 to 10 years, has been the SEO or search engine optimization specialist. You could have the greatest website in the world and nobody knows how to get to it. Or you could take it a step further. You could have the greatest products on the greatest website in the world and no one knows how to get to your particular product. And so this is really where the SEO specialist steps in. Also being able to make sure that your page is navigatable by any sort of web crawler to be able to identify then what resources are on your products page, for instance, or your about page. And if you think about it, you're probably seeing more and more of this, in that if you Google one of your favorite locations locally, you'll see that automatically pops up things like their hours of operation and so on. And this really starts to get into the whole concept of Web 3.0 and semantic web. Now, some of the additional roles that you want to consider with respect to web development: requirements engineer. Requirements engineer is going to be the person that interacts directly with your clients. They will possibly embed themselves in with their client to really understand the particular process that they're trying to model. They act as somewhat of a liaison between your client and your development team so that you don't end up consuming time unnecessarily of your development team. The requirements engineer will oftentimes have very good social skills, very good document skills, so that they can adequately convey the client's concerns or the client's requests then to your development team. Some additional roles to consider are going to be the content strategist, marketing technologist. Those are basically kind of fancy ways of describing the roles associated with how do you present your product. What types of, for instance, images will correctly draw in your customers to a particular product. Who is your target audience, for instance? Are you looking, for instance, at the right age or right demographics for a particular product? And how do you market to those people on the internet? And we've seen a lot of evolution in this, especially in the last few years of social media, as companies have shifted their strategies to and from different social media platforms. Project manager and product manager, this is more of a classic role, looks at, for instance, marketing or development of web resources associated with a particular product. They might be interested, for instance, in support of a particular product. The best example I can give you here is if you take a look at some of the major computer manufacturers, Dell, HP, and so on, they will oftentimes have a particular customer experience associated with a particular product line. In other words, their home consumers may get a different experience than their business consumers and so on. Business analyst is starting to fall out of scope a little bit for our web development, but they're fundamentally the ones that would look at the market as a whole to determine whether there's actually a need. There's additional non-technical roles as well. Probably the best example that I could give you, although it's not truly non-technical, would be, for instance, in the classical graphics design. In other words, someone has to make the pretty images or the pretty pictures, the nice banners, the graphics behind it. And while those are not necessarily non-technical roles, they definitely fall a little more on the creative end of the spectrum. And so you can see there's the roles associated with the back end that are perhaps a little more classical, a little more regimented, structured, however you want to think about it, all the way through to the creative aspects of web development. So the last thing we want to take a look at is the different type of companies you might find yourself working for. So web hosting companies, their sole responsibility potentially could be just simply to support your website. In other words, they stand up an Apache web server for you or an IIS server for you, and they give you a login and a password, and that's it. They offer minimal support. They probably have a call center if the website goes down, or if you need a backup, for instance, from a previous version of something that you had broken. But fundamentally, they do not offer significant support for the development of a website. Now, this is once again a little bit of a gray area. Particularly what you'll see is that hosting companies and design companies will often act together. Design companies may or may not actually have any sort of hosting resources available to them. Translation, they may not have a data center on site. The hosting company, of course, is going to have the data center on site, or at least have access to the data center. The design company is going to be focusing mainly on the development of the site. And so they're going to be the ones that are going to be very much in tune with the tools that are available, the graphics tools, the graphics that you can use, for instance, image libraries that you might be able to use, etc. And then as you think of this more of a somewhat of a vertical stack here, if you would, or moving up in the roles, you can have complete website solution companies that may have both the design and the hosting capabilities encapsulated, although they may simply just contract out the hosting portion of it. The idea with the website solution companies is you as a small business owner just simply go straight to these website solution companies and say, I just need a website. I don't care how you do it. Here's the money. And the idea is then that they will do that completely for you. Now, the website solution companies, the design companies, and the hosting companies obviously all can work together. The platforms like Wix, for instance, further blur that line, because if you've noticed, if you've played around a little bit with Wix.com, you'll see that they essentially provide you with the development environment that will allow for you to design, and they will ultimately host your website for you. And so you can see where there isn't necessarily a clear distinction anymore between some of these different companies and different resources. And then you also have the vertically integrated companies, which essentially encapsulate all of the prior roles, as well as some of the back-end roles. In other words, in some cases, they may can be, perhaps for cost reasons, perhaps for security reasons, hosting not only the web server, but also the database server in a data center. And the advantage with these vertically integrated companies is that gives you exposure to all aspects of web development and software development, all the way from the architecture potentially all the way through to the front end development. And so it really is advantageous for you to consider one of these vertically integrated companies, because you may get exposure to multiple aspects of web development. Now, the one thing to also note with vertically integrated companies and also with startup companies is you will find yourself potentially having multiple roles, particularly if it's a smaller startup company, in that you may find yourself being both the database administrator as well as the system administrator. Now, with that overlap in the roles means that you can, if you're not careful, potentially lead to conflicts of interest. Translation: the database administrator might be a little more flippant with the security aspect of things and may end up doing something that may essentially not be best practices with system administration. So you want to be real careful when you're thinking in terms of these startup companies. However, both in the example of the startup company and vertically integrated companies gives you a tremendous opportunity for professional growth. Internal web development is one that is not considered often enough, and it can actually be quite rewarding. Those are the roles that are going to be required for setting up perhaps a company's internal website. And that may be a classic website, it may be static or even a dynamic website, or it may be related to things like, for instance, their internal product documentation, internal bug reporting, and so on. The main distinction with internal web development is that oftentimes your customers are your colleagues. And as such, then you may not be necessarily worried so much about public level security, because oftentimes the entire development environment, including the end result, in other words, the website, is all behind a firewall, and that you only have to worry about internal permissions. And oftentimes that's going to be handled by another mechanism. But internal web development can also be quite rewarding. The freelance consulting then is also another option. Basically, what you would do is you would partner with perhaps some sort of hosting company, and you would just simply do the web development and agree then to some consulting fees for a particular client to support their website, maybe doing periodic updates and so on. And so that's something that would highly encourage you to consider doing even after completing this series, is that you simply look into what you have already done and what you can do for others. So as always, I hope you found this video useful. If you've got any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and thank you for watching.